And welcome to today's webinar, How to Engage Communities and Collaborate to Manage Water Risk. Thank you very much for joining us today. 2 Degrees is delighted to have with us Daniel Yeo, Senior Policy Analyst of Water Security and Climate Change at WaterAid. Now, before we begin, there are a few technical instructions for this webinar. If you have any problems with the technology or audio, please use the chat box on the right-hand side to send me a message. Select from the drop-down menu, send your message, and then I'll get back to you. We're due to ask questions throughout the presentation, and we'll also hold a Q&A session at the end of the webinar. Now, ask your question, type into the Q&A box on the bottom right-hand side of your screen, and press send. And finally, if you'd like to connect through your phone, please use the chat box to contact me for details. Now that out of the way, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Dan.
Yes, I'm here.
So I'm just handing it over to you, and you can go ahead and get started.
Great, thank you. Great. Well, thank you very much, first of all. So I've got a few slides here I just wanted to talk through, really. And I guess to start with, what I'm trying to do is to engage you guys in a conversation. I've no idea about any of your backgrounds at the moment. I can't see a list of you at the moment, but yeah, so I'm just going to kind of share some thoughts and some reflections on water, risk, and people. I'm really, as I'm trying to engage people in conversation here, I'm not trying to say that I've got the answers, but what I want to do is try to challenge you to think differently about the nature of water risk. There's a lot of material here on 2 Degrees and other websites about specific aspects of water risk. What I'm just going to do is explore a bit of the side around people, really, to talk through about why you might care about community engagement, the nature of water risk in some of the countries that we're in WaterAid work in, and it's basically low-income developing countries. Some reflections on what responsible businesses could do, and then explore where responsible business has got shared agendas with NGOs like WaterAid, and some areas where we might consider working together. It's kind of indicated that lots of people would be interested in understanding the sort of how side and some examples of what other businesses are doing. So I'm hopefully going to highlight some of that. As you said, feel free to ask questions along the way, and give me out if there's anything that's not clear or anything you'd like me to sort of dwell a bit further on. So, okay, hopefully that works. Can everybody see that?
Yep, that works just fine.
Great. So just to start off with, talk a bit about community engagement and why you might want to think about doing it. Well, sort of, we're all interested in water risk. That's why we're in this group. That's why we're here at this webinar. But what we tend to do is focus on the immediate aspects of water risk that relate to us and our activities and our own sphere of influence immediately. And what I want to try and do is to present water as a multi-scalar risk that affects you at different levels. There are lots of different ways about why you might want to engage with communities. Generally, when we talk about community engagement, we tend to think about sort of community projects, about gaining trust, about maintaining license to operate. But what I want to do is to show you another way of looking at different aspects of that. So first of all, really, this is sort of multiple gears of looking at what you might call water security or water risk. There's obviously the operations side. You have enough water for what you want to do. You can extend beyond that and think about the basin. Does the basin have enough water? And think about the water resource as a whole. Then the aspect of community engagement that a lot of people, a lot of organisations, is the drive and the entry point for a lot of organisations, which is around reputational risk and how you're perceived by the communities within which you work and that you interact with, which is really about thinking, are you preventing others from having enough? Is your water security having an impact on other people? But the here is then about, well, actually, what about these indirect risks? What about everyone else in society? Does everyone in society have enough? And is that relevant to you? And is that outside your sphere of influence? And should you therefore, why should you care about some of those issues? And really, what I'm trying to cover in this few minutes is really to think about the fact that that if society and the context within which you're working doesn't have adequate access to water and sanitation, then that can have an indirect impact upon your business and environment by affecting the stability of the country, by affecting your employees, by affecting the very context within which your business operates. And that's a side of sort of water risk that I don't hear a lot of, and I'm interested in exploring and hearing some of your views about whether that is, you do feel that that's relevant, or that is something that you or your corporate risk teams or strategy teams are thinking about and looking at. So the key point here is that risk, water security isn't just about you; it's about water security and water risk for wider society. So, what's the nature of that water risk in countries that we work in, the low-income countries, developing countries? Well, there are a host of different aspects to it. First of all, livelihoods and the economies as a whole are exposed to or water dependent. So whether they're highly agriculturally based, so a lot of rain-fed agriculture, or whether water is a part in the economy or in wider ways. When you combine that with areas that have very variable rainfall, that can change a lot and is then further affected by things like climate change, and doesn't necessarily have a huge amount of buffers or storage, well then you get a very fragile economy that can be vulnerable to water-related risks and shocks. The side we tend to focus on. But the other side is around the lack of basic services. So having access to water and sanitation obviously has a direct economic, health and energy impacts, but also undermine perceptions of legitimacy and whether or not stability of society. If there's this huge degree of inequality, it can lead to political, social instability. And so that's another aspect of risk that I think is often overlooked in some of the countries we work on. When we talk about water and water risk, we tend to focus on of scarcity. But more often than not, in the countries in which we work, it's not about the water not being there, but it's about having access. And access is the issue in most countries in which we work. And what I'd like to try and explore, get you guys to think about more, is about how do we think about those two things together? So this scarcity and the environmental risks that we're fairly familiar with and relatively well versed, but where does that then intersect with the societal risk and the human aspect of it? I'm going to go through some of the human side of water and sanitation, and some of you may be familiar with this, so I apologise if this is ground you've already covered, but I'm just going to kind of quickly go through this and then look at what occasions of that be and why it might be relevant to you. So first of all, some headline stats. Around about 10 people don't have access to safe water. More than a third don't have adequate sanitation, so clean and safe to go to the toilet that essentially separates their feeds from their drinking water and their food. And when you start to think about that, there's a huge amount of people. It's 2.5 billion people, a third of the world's population. And to drill down into that, there's other figures like about 1 billion people still defecating in the open. And it's sort of quite grounding to think about that in the context of our daily lives. So what impact of that? Well, things like under-5 mortality. So the second biggest disease cause of death in under-5s is diarrhea. It kills more people than AIDS. It kills more children than AIDS, malaria, and measles combined. Yet it's something that's quite easily preventable with decent sanitation and clean water. There's impact in terms of collecting time. Predominantly women and children have to spend a lot of time collecting, and that's time that can be could be better spent on education, on work, on looking after families, and on a whole heap of other issues. There's an impact on education in terms of school days lost. Again, in terms of productive days lost, either through sickness, through disease, through death, through having to take on work that other people are unable to do. And then it increases people's vulnerability to climatic variability, because most of the people who don't have access to safe water are reliant upon surface water sources, which are inherently more exposed to changing rainfall, rising temperatures, that sort of thing. So shifting them to improving their access is partly about moving them to more resilient sources of water that are more insulated, if you like, against those sorts of changes. So some of the impacts that we certainly see in the work that we do at WaterAid. The big question is, well, why does this matter to you? And these are the three things I'm saying. There's a direct impact on your workforce if you have employees or staff in developing countries who are affected directly either through their own health or through their family or through having to collect those sorts of issues. There are impacts down through your supply chain that you may not even necessarily be aware of, depending on the nature of your supply chain and the sorts of organisations you work for. And then there's this issue that inequality can undermine economic stability. Now, it's easy to say, oh yeah, that's something that happens, but there's a really example of that was relatively recent in South Africa in one of the townships there, where the lack of access to toilets and the failure of the government to deliver on its promises on toilets led to a huge amount of unrest and violence and protests that affected the stability, the social and political stability of the area, and that sort of thing, is you can begin to see those tensions rising up, and there's an argument that some of those underlying social tensions were underlying drivers behind things like the events in the Arab Spring. So that's kind of my proposition to you about why this sort of matters. That you can actually do about it. First step, and which is what I've been trying to hear, is about thinking about water risk in a much broader sense. So yes, thinking about the physical side and all the sorts of work that a lot of people. Sorry, I've seen a comment there. Somebody said they can't hear me very well, so I'm going to hopefully speak a bit louder and move the microphone closer to my mouth. Getting beyond just the physical and also thinking about what are the impacts on equality and inequality and tension in the societies in which you're working. So it's understanding those broader issues. And then in terms of actual response, well, yes, there's the managing side, manage the water, the physical water compared to physical resource, which is where most of the attention is on. There's a lot of material around on that. But then on the social side, it's thinking about, well, actually, you're not alone in some of these issues. So it's partly building trust and working with other people who you might not conventionally work with, any other partners. But it's also being aware of what's going on in what I've called the development landscape. So what are others doing? What are NGOs doing? What is the government doing around some of these things? What are other businesses doing? Both in terms of the project side, so what's best practice, what works, what doesn't work, how can you cut and save some of the mistakes that other people have made in the past. But also on the policy side, actually, what are the bigger picture issues that are going on here? Is there something you can do above and beyond just small-scale projects? And that last piece is also about get more value money. So it's not just about doing your projects. How do you ensure that your projects deliver a bigger impact above and beyond what you can just do on your own? So sort of scaling that impact. What time is it now? Okay, I'm gonna whiz through some of the reasons why people don't have access to water, because I don't think these are often talked about, and I think it certainly took me a while to understand these when I first came to WaterAid. But and to say the world is running out of water and people don't have access to water in the same breath, as if they are there's a direct causality between the two. When you look at the statistics and you look at the reality, the reason why people don't have access to water is not because it's not there. You'll hear people say a lot of the time, only 1% of the world's water is fresh water, and that is true, only 1% of it is. But we only use less than 10% of that fresh water that is available to us. And here's some figures about the availability of water in some countries you would consider to be water scarce, water stressed, and you can compare the availability to the amount is actually used. it's a fairly similar story across most of the world. There are some notable exceptions, particularly in North Africa, but the key issue is that it's not to do with availability of water. Three reasons, really. I can go into lots of depth about this, but I'm not going to. I'm going to just skim over it quite quickly. But this is that the supposed to go towards improving access to water doesn't reach where it's needed. So, there's a degree of there's money that's needed to do stuff. That's the big red circle. The set of commitments that governments make, or owners make, that it doesn't quite meet the need itself. Those commitments don't always get allocated and don't always get turned into real money. So that's then the purple circle. And money that is allocated isn't always spent. So, it's just this funnel that means that the money that's available isn't necessarily reaching where it's needed. And with it also, that money isn't necessarily spent on the right places. So we've done some research recently in a report called Off Track, Off Target, which looks at where global flows of money for water and sanitation are going, and they're going to countries relatively sort of middle income and more developed countries like Egypt and Iraq and Malaya, rather than places like Liberia or Sierra Leone or Niger or countries where there really is the need. So a combination of not enough money and not being targeted to the right places. And kind of continuing on this theme of targeting, the poor are being left behind, essentially, in simple terms. So this shows the degree of sanitation coverage in three countries, India, Bangladesh and Nepal. And you can see that the rates of progress are quite substantially different for the lowest wealth quintile, which is the pillar to the left of the left as you look at it, compared to the wealthiest quintiles. In South Africa, the poorest people are 15 times more likely to use unimproved sanitation. And again, that's partly to do with targeting and how the resources are focused. And lastly, things down. We all know this. It's not just a matter of putting stuff in. Sometimes things break down. This is an example. It's not actually real data, unfortunately, but this is an example of the water point mapper, which is something we work on. And this is some sample data that's mapping water points and their functionality. So the different colours indicate what percentage of the water points are functional in that particular district. This is just this is sample data, but actually it's fairly reflective of some of the images we see where 40% of water points aren't necessarily functioning. And that can have an implication for you, because if people don't have access to water, or their water points are breaking down, and your company or your operations are in the area, there's a risk that you're perceived to be responsible somehow just because you're in the area, and you guys have got access to water and we don't, and that's back to that sense of inequality. So that's a sort of a 3-point overview of the complexity of the policy problem on access to water and sanitation. We've got plenty of material that backs that up, but that's sort of the headline elements of it. So to give you some examples of some of the ways that we work with different organisations on some of these issues, are really at the start of our journey in lots of ways, but just here are some examples on how we're working with different companies that range in scale and sort of scope. So, we're working on implementation projects where we've got partners such as H&M who are funding some of our existing work, our direct implementation work. We have strategic partnerships. The biggest one for us is the water program. We're partnering with HEC, WWF, and Earthwatt. A range of things. So some project delivery. It's also about employee engagement, engaging HSBC staff around the world, but also about informing and supporting policymakers on some of the decisions that they're making through evidence and practice. Those stuff that works. Other examples are we're working alongside Unilever. Again, some practical work in Bangladesh and an attempt to innovate and try some new systemic ways of creating change by working across lots of different development areas in one go in a project called Laser Beam. Austin Powers, for those of you who've seen that film, but anyway. And we're also engaged
to them on sort of the policy level, talking to them around the post-2015 development framework, what that looks like, and also through some of the other advocacy work that we're doing. And then learning together. So kind of areas, leading edge thinking. So, for example, working with the Institute of Human Rights on business and human rights and business and the rights of water. Looking at some case studies we're developing some case studies on business engagement and water and sanitation to sort of try and expose some of that a bit more and learn some of the lessons and share some of the good practice. And then an example is this webinar here, where I'm hoping we can have quite an interesting conversation and explore some areas together. There are plenty of other examples out there, so and some from areas where you wouldn't necessarily expect. So there are companies that work on water resources who have quite a clear strategic interest in doing that. People like SB Miller, who are doing some great work with WWF through their Water Futures program and are looking to expand that outwards. Coca-Cola as well are doing some interesting work in Africa, as are Diageo. And they're all obviously, food and beverage companies, so they are, there's much more clear strategic and business case for them to be involved. There are some other examples from slightly less more surprising places, particularly in the extractive industry. So Anglo-American ArcelorMittal, who provide a lot of water and sanitation for their employees and effectively end up building small towns. They're working alongside local governments to build their capacity to run those facilities and to maintain those facilities. And so De Beers have been doing work in Namibia on formation, where they're essentially preparing mine closure and handing over small towns and fitting them back into the national sort of democratic system. So there are some ideas and some areas for collaboration to explore. And really, I wanted to leave you with this. These are some of the key messages I hope have come across clearly, and I hope you've been able to hear me. That throughout water security and risk has been about availability of the physical resource and about access, and that is those things need to go together. Second, that the risks to society are indirect risks to corporates. So they may not necessarily be things you immediately think of, but actually they can potentially present long-term risks and opportunities to your company, supply chain. Other people access matters to you for those two reasons above, and for more than just the reputational reasons. It's more than just about license to operate. There's a bigger context to look at. And then finally, you're not on these issues. It's a big area. It's quite a complex area. There's a lot of different actors. So it's really important, I think, to reach out and try and hear what other people are working on and look for those links across. So that was a pretty fast sort of rattle through. And I'm looking forward to hearing some questions and thoughts and reflections from others.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Dan. I'm going to go ahead and now speed on to our Q&A session. So to all our attendees out there, remember you can submit a question by typing into the Q&A box on the bottom right-hand side of your screen. So for our first question today, I guess it's kind of there. How can I convince my board to look more into the water problem? So I think it's just convincing, or what kind of arguments can be used? Dan, do you have any ideas or thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, it's hopefully this kind of works. Oh, we go. Yes. Well, I mean, it depends on kind of your, I guess, how enlightened your board is, what sort of views your board's looking at more generally. If you've got a board that is on board to the concepts of sustainability, cares about sustainability, then I think you're a relatively easier case, and that's partly about thinking in these. So I brought this slide up, thinking in these kind of concentric circles of relevance and impact. So, understanding the potential risks and the potential impact of water shortages and water availability on operations, and then thinking out from there, depending on I guess, what the appetite is at the board. I mean, if you've got a board that's just not even thinking about sustainability issues more broadly and is just more focused on operational strategic issues, then it's about translating the risk into something that's understandable. So, thinking about it in operational terms. So what would happen if you didn't have enough water? What would the costs of that be, and the impact on operations?
Okay, for your response. For our next question, how do groups determine best practices and what is emerging? Is there a set of principles to help determine this?
There's two ways of answering that. One, I think yes, in terms of, as I said, the water resources side, a lot of good practice out there. The CEO Water Mandate has some case studies and material there, which is worth looking at, and there are some principles there around responsible use of water that a whole load of chief execs have signed up to. So it's worth looking at those. But from the points that I've kind of been making here around access to water and sanitation, some of these broader perspectives on water, I haven't seen a lot of sort of what I'd call best practice or evidence of that out there, which is what I'd like to do that work with IHRB to try to document and share some of that to help people and to broaden conversation now. I think there is some good practice out there, and as I said, people like SAB Miller and their Water Futures program are interesting to look at.
Okay, thank you, Dan. For our next question, could you go more in depth with your collaborations, H&M? Have had many successes with these programs?
I mean, the H&M example is, basically are funding some of the core work that we do in terms of providing water and sanitation. So there are three things that we largely do at WaterAid. One is working with communities on providing basic services, access to water and sanitation, but also helping them to lobby their own governments and decision makers on that front. And the second aspect we work on is about building local government capacity, and the third is about trying to change national and international policies around that. So, for example, on H&M, we've been working in Bangladesh with them on some project in I think it's in slums in Dhaka, where we've increased, we've provided safe water and sanitation to people. So in that respect, yes, there've been some results. But that's obviously only looking at just the implementation side on particular aspects, and that fits in more with their sort of communication strategy rather than necessarily core operational impacts.
Oh, and then
do you want any more detail on that? I don't know if I can see the question.
Do you have any more details on to maybe for the other ones that you have in there, apart from H&M, HSBC,
sure.
or the conversations with Unilever? I think those would be good to kind of explore a little bit more.
Yeah, well, I mean, the HSBC one has been really interesting because, the partners there are WaterAid. We work on the sort of inside the access to water and sanitation, but also WWF, who do much more of the bigger water resources issues and managing water at a basin level, as well as Earthwatch, who describe themselves as citizen science organisation, which is about engaging people in science issues and understanding what's going on. So that's been a really interesting one about how, and really what I think has been most interesting about that is some of the conversations we've had between the different partners about and trying to find areas where we've got overlaps. That program's relatively recently started, so things are just kicking off, but we're working with them in I can't remember off the top of it now, Bangladesh and Nepal, I think, and then in West Africa, in Nigeria and Ghana. And I think we're exploring doing something in Tanzania together on that. So that's been quite an interesting aspect. And we're looking to engage more in conversations about how they might influence water security through their investment portfolio, for example, and whether there are kind of either some criteria they might apply to certain investments, or where we might choose to develop some financial products or services that might actually contribute to some of these bigger picture issues that I talked about. And then, on the Unilever side, Paul Polman is the series there's something called the Level Panel that's looking at what happens after the MDGs, what's the future framework of development after the MDGs, and we've been engaged with his advocacy team around some of the implications of that for access to water and sanitation.
Okay, great. So I think we're getting a bit closer to time, so I'm going to ask a final question that's here. You mentioned that money is not being allocated to the right place. I think that's in relation to one of your previous slides. Why do you suspect this is the case?
I'm picking up. I like the pig. In the context of water and sanitation, it's partly because it's not kind of the most sexy of issues. No military necessarily wants to be seen opening a sewage plant. It's slightly different from opening a hospital or a school. So I think there's an element of that. There's also, I think we don't understand enough about where need is and where and what the challenges and problems are. What those barriers are at the moment. So, for example, some of the work we've done looking at a local level is around how local government authorities in many countries we work don't have the facilities or people, resources to adequately deliver. And a lot of the countries we work in have these decentralised policies where it's pushed down to a local level. But if there's one guy in a hut with a motorbike and he's supposed to be responsible for providing water and sanitation or maintaining the facilities for a whole district, then that's quite a challenge. So there's a range of issues from sort of capacity in the sector, but the sort of political prioritisation. And let's face it, some of the aid that gets spent on water and sanitation is spent for political purposes rather than because of the level of need. Okay,
so Dan, we have a few questions left over here. Is it possible to be able to get in contact to answer our leftover questions? They're on guidelines and crowdsourcing.
Yeah, hopefully that's popped back up. Email's there, and I'm also on Twitter, so there's my Twitter handle and my email address. Happy to kind of answer those questions in slightly longer time.
Okay. So I think we've hit our time for today, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap up for now. So I'd like to thank all the attendees for participating today, for your questions and comments and ideas. And a very big thanks to Dan for a great presentation today. Thanks a lot for that, Dan. The recorded relevant info will be posted shortly on the Water Risk and Strategy group on the 2 Degrees site. I'll also be sending a follow-up email with the slides and recordings available to everyone. With that, Dan, is it possible for email to be posted there in case anybody wants to get in contact?
Yeah, sure, that's fine.
Great. Okay, so with that out of the way, I'm going to go ahead and say thanks again for joining, and everyone have a great day.
Okay, thanks very much.